So now we're up to chapter 28, the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is this period of time when, in around 1300 AD, that scholars started to look at classical writings from the Romans and the Greeks and started to think more and more about how, hey, they've been spending an awful lot of time on religion. Maybe they should think about humanity and its place in the universe. So he started to think about this movement that later on becomes called humanist, the humanist movements, and that leads to the Renaissance, which simply means rebirth. And it started in the Italian city-states, in Florence and Venice and the Papal States in Italy. Those are the early leaders, and if you look at that map, you can see where each of those are. Each of these areas were wealthy from trade and had powerful families and taking control of the areas from the trade guilds, and that ended up meaning that they could spend lots of money. The rulers, they wanted to be remembered for more than just power, so they sponsored artists and architects. Then they set up schools for rich sons that focused on classical learning. The artists were wanted by different city-states, and they really developed their own style based on Roman and Greek influence, because I mean, that makes sense that in Italy you would be looking at the Roman stuff, and the Greeks also had major influences on Rome, so certainly that makes sense. Artists started to create more lifelike works using perspective, and you can see that this looks like the stuff in the background is further back because it's smaller, and that's the whole idea of perspective. So that's really a new innovation. And the leaders of city-states paid artists to decorate their homes and gardens, which started to get portrait painting, and this one here is Lorenzo de' Medici, who's someone who we'll get to in a minute. Leonardo da Vinci, he's the most famous, probably, Renaissance artist. He painted an Italian woman named, Italian noblewoman named in the Mona Lisa, and Christ's Last Meal and the Last Supper are two of the most famous paintings in history. And he was also a scientist and inventor, and he focused a lot on military designs and a lot of flying machines and anatomy and all these interesting things. So that's where we get the term Renaissance man. It's kind of Leonardo da Vinci is the the real Renaissance man, because he did all these things and he did them well. Now Michelangelo, he is the artist who's known for the Sistine Chapel, the Pieta, and the sculptor of David. He's known most as a sculptor, but also he was quite a painter, as you can see in this. This is the Sistine Chapel. And in city life, the cities were pretty narrow. There were open sewers. Most people were poor, just like in the Middle Ages, but there were a few very rich people. The center square of the city was called the Piazza, and this is actually the Venetian Piazza. Family roles were very traditional, with the man, the husband, being in charge. In Florence, the Renaissance began in Florence partially because the Medici family paid a lot of money for artists, poets, and philosophers. And this here is actually Brunelleschi's dome, which is still a startling sort of landmark in Florence. It's really impressive. Just this dome out of nowhere that sat unfinished for a while until Brunelleschi was able to figure out how to make it. And they decorated the city, these artists did, and by 1490, when trade started declining, merchants complained that Medicis were spending too much, and so eventually the Medicis were overthrown by a monk named Savonarola. He was later overthrown, and the Medicis were invited back. And but by that point, the Renaissance, they kind of moved on to other places. Papal States, the power of the popes declined in 1300s and 1400s because basically they weren't all that religious. This guy right here, Alexander VI, it's reported or believed by a lot of people that he actually bribed his way to becoming pope. He was an important religious official, but still the pope selection process was probably a little bit tainted that year. And his son was able to take over a lot of central Italy by force, partially because of the name Borgia. And there's even a TV show now at Showtime called The Borgias, which sort of talks about their family and how kind of messed up it was. Rome took over leadership of the Renaissance after Florence declined. That's where you get things like the Sistine Chapel. Now Venice was influenced by Constantinople since they traded a lot with them. And Venice had a series of islands linked by canals. And they had a ruler that was a ruling council that chose a leader called the Doge, and people were expected to be very, very loyal. And if they weren't, then they could have lots of problems, including being arrested. When France goes ahead and invades Italy, at one point, they start to realize, hey, there's some cool stuff going on here. And they start adopting the style of art and writing. For example, this one here is a chateau, a castle that was designed. And you can see the gardens here. They're really attractive. That's a really cool castle, I think. Now, in Germany and Flanders, it also spread to Germany and Flanders because scholars started actually openly, on some level, criticize how church leaders, these sort of corrupt church leaders, had interpreted the Bible to meet their own needs. And so this, you could say that this is sort of the pre-Reformation sort of volley at the Catholic Church. Erasmus goes ahead and writes something called In Praise of Folly, which attacks corrupt church practices and leaders. And they start to adopt the values of the Renaissance as well. Gutenberg develops the printing press, and that makes it easier to transmit knowledge. An incredibly important invention, because without that, people don't read or don't learn to read because there's no reason to, because there aren't books. They're readily accessible. And anytime you want a book, you have to pay someone to actually go ahead and copy it word for word down, which means that only rich people have books. But this really leads to it being that more and more people start getting books. Van Eyck, the Van Eyck brothers started to use oil paints that make for richer paintings and richer colors, and you can texturize paintings more. And so it's really interesting. This is one of their examples here. In Spain, the Renaissance of Spain was influenced by the really close relationship between church and state. It shows up in Spain a little bit later, and universities were founded. And this here is an image from Don Quixote, which is this knight, and sort of makes fun of the whole idea of knighthood in the Middle Ages. And he's a knight who is actually defending the honor of this one woman who is not very honorable, but he actually is sort of a crazy knight. He attacks that windmill thinking it's a dragon, and yeah, and this is his squire. So anyhow, interesting, funny sort of book. Now, in England, after the 100 Years' War, the families of Lancaster and York fought over who should rule the country, because you see Edward up here, Edward III, he was the last united ruler on some level. And then what happened was his son, who should have been the next leader, Edward, whose nickname is the Black Prince, he dies before Edward III dies, so the throne passes down to Richard, and Richard doesn't do a particularly good job of ruling. So this family over here, Henry IV's family, when actually John of Gaunt, that's one of Richard's uncles, they sort of get along, sort of don't get along, but when John of Gaunt dies, then actually Richard kind of tries to take all of his stuff, and that really gets Henry IV really mad, and that, well, he's not Henry IV at that point, it's just Henry, and then he's able to get support from the other nobles that felt ripped off by Richard, and eventually lead a revolt. And so this is the Lancasterian part of the family that just keeps on trading back and forth and back and forth. And over here we have the Yorkists, and there's lots and lots of problems until eventually, this was called the War of the Roses because the Lancaster family sort of symbol was a red rose, and the York family was a white rose. And then eventually, with a lot of intermarrying, a lot of trading back and forth, a lot of murder and all these things like that, you end up with Henry VII. And he's the first Tudor. He's kind of on the Lancaster side, and that's the actual symbol there. So it's both a white and a red rose, and it's sort of the whole idea of the marriages and everything like that. Both families are sort of semi-united, but really, at some level, the Lancasterians win. So the first Tudor king was Henry VIII, really, and he makes the country stronger. Well, Henry VII, and then he builds trade and things like that. Now, Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, is very well known. He starts adopting more of the ways of the Renaissance. Again, it hits in England later than in other places. Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth, is also very popular with her people. And a lot of this is intermixed with the whole problem of the Reformation, which we'll deal with in the next chapter. And during the time in the Renaissance, that's when we get Shakespeare, wrote a whole lot of plays, and some of his most popular plays include things like Hamlet. This is an image from Hamlet, Sir Laurence Olivier, and the York scene, and then we have Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, comedies like Midsummer Night's Dream, all these things. Tremendously prolific and important playwright. So there we go.